wisdom. Who were the sages? If you recall, in the Old Testament, there's this kingdom, the nation of Israel. There were a number of high-profile occupations, individuals whose job it was to nurture and foster the life of the nation of Israel. There were prophets. These were the rabble-rousing preachers, the black and white people who said, this is right and this is wrong, do what's right, and if you do what's wrong, you are in big trouble. They were bossy, aggressive, sort of in your face. And just between you and me, I think I would find it very difficult to spend the weekend camping with these guys. They were so abrasive, cut from a rougher grade of sandpaper than most. There were priests, those who were in charge of fostering the spiritual life of the kingdom of Israel, in charge of sacrifices and rituals and ceremonies and pilgrimages and prayers, whether in the tabernacle or the temple, fostering the spiritual life of the nation. Prophet, priest, king, the top political leader, pretty much in charge of everything, taxation, armies, wars, and so forth. Prophet, priest, and king, but then there's this overlooked group called sages. Who and what were the sages? They were what we today would call partly philosophers, because they asked the big questions of life. What's the point of all this? Where is God? Why is there suffering? Why is there evil? How do we foster shalom among ourselves? Shalom is an Old Testament word that means harmony, peace, having our act together, similar to what Jesus said in the New Testament about having an abundant life. Shalom is an Old Testament way of saying abundant life. So these sage philosophers were trying to figure out, how do we achieve shalom? They were also psychologists, fascinated about what makes us tick. Why do we say the things we do? Why do we act the way we act? How do we foster shalom in our own heads? Because often there's competing desires, there's conflict in there. How do we foster shalom between people? Conflict resolution. How do we foster shalom between us and God? So the sages were part philosophers, part psychologists. To keep them clear, if you're a fan of Star Wars, think of it this way. The prophets were stormtroopers. The priests were Jedi Knights. The kings were like the emperor. And the sages, Yoda. I put a verse in the bulletin, Jeremiah 18. 3 of those 4 are mentioned, prophet, priest, and sage. And the word sage actually appears in the New American Standard Version. The sages are kind of sprinkled all throughout the Old Testament. The biggest concentration of the sage writings, the wisdom literature, Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Song of Solomon. In the Old Testament, many sages are named. There are the men of Hezekiah, Proverbs 25. Lemuel wrote Proverbs 31. He quoted his mother a lot, so I'm including Lemuel's mother as a sage. Agur wrote chapter 30. Kohelet wrote the book of Ecclesiastes. The wise men are mentioned in Proverbs 24. And I am including the virtuous woman in chapter 31 as one of the sages. It says in verse 26, she speaks with wisdom, and faithful instruction is on her tongue. That's the work of the sage, speaking with wisdom and faithful instruction on her tongue. Then, of course, the most famous sage was Solomon. King Solomon was also a sage. In 1 Kings 4, it says Solomon spoke 3,000 proverbs, and he wrote 1,005 songs. One prolific fellow. Do you know the name Woody Guthrie? If you're my age, you remember Arlo Guthrie, Alice's Restaurant? His dad, Woody Guthrie, was a folk singer in the 30s during the Dust Bowl and 40s and 50s and beyond. He had a theory about songwriting. He said, my goal is to write 1,000 songs in hopes that at least one of them will be good. Well, it turns out many of them were good, including the state theme song in Washington, Roll on Columbia, about the Grand Coulee Dam. So he said, I want to write a lot of songs in hopes that some of them will be good. Solomon, he wrote over 1,000. They're probably all good. One of them ended up in the Bible. Know what it's called? of Solomon. Easy. Where did the sages get their wisdom? They were observers. They were what we would call reflective believers. They would observe things and reflect upon what they saw. So one day, sage walking down the road, he said, I went past a field that was covered with thorns, weeds all over the place. The stone wall was in ruin. This is in chapter 24, verse 32. And then he said this, I applied my heart to what I observed and learned a lesson from what I saw. So he observed and learned. You've heard about the 2 books of Revelation that God reveals himself in Scripture and God reveals himself in nature. The sages loved to read nature. And they observed not just weedy yards, all sorts of things. Weather, snow, rain, wind, drought, agriculture, cycles in nature, sun, moon, including human relationships. They were people watchers, psychologists. So they observed family dynamics and neighborhood conflicts and courtroom dramas and political intrigue and business transactions. They were watching and listening, connecting dots and making analogies, making word pictures, cooking up wise sayings, sometimes short little sayings called Proverbs, sometimes big books like in Job or Ecclesiastes. They also observed animals. So if you're an animal lover, you're going to love the book of Proverbs. 24 animals are mentioned in Proverbs. Lions, locusts, leeches, lizards, oxen, horses, sheep, pigs, dogs, eagles, sparrows, vipers, donkey, buzzards, roosters, rock badgers, goats, gazelles. Did I leave any out? Ants. In chapter 6, the sage says, go to the ant, consider its ways, and be wise. Now, this is profound, because the sage is saying, you want wisdom, you begin by doing observation. You look at an ant, learn from her ways. As far as I know, there were no zoos back in Bible times. So this is somewhat astonishing. The sages knew that if you see a mother bear and her cubs, do not get between them. You're in big trouble if you do. So again, I hope they didn't learn by trial and error, but they said if you see a mother bear, don't you try to take those cubs or you're going to be in trouble. So they observed. They're watching these bears, cubs. And then one day a sage realized, you know what? It's better to meet a bear robbed of her cub than to run into a fool in his or her folly. So as dangerous as it is to mess with a mother bear and her cubs, you're in deeper trouble if you hang out with fools in their folly. Okay, the sages observed, they write down Proverbs, and the high water mark, in my mind, of wisdom in the Old Testament is the book of Proverbs. There are 915 Proverbs in the book. Some of those verses are in a couplet, a sentence and another sentence. Harsh word stirs up anger, soft word turns away wrath. So of those 915 Proverbs, many of those could be divided in half, making a grand total of little nuggets of wisdom, like over 1,000. So I've chosen several, particularly those that answer the question, what did the sages think about the future? So here we are, first Sunday of the year, we're looking to 2016. What kind of sage wisdom do the sages give us concerning looking at the future? So the first proverb is somewhat jarring. So brace yourself. Chapter 27, verse 1 says this. Do not boast about tomorrow, for you do not know what a day may bring forth. Philosophers say that the future is opaque, meaning it's like a big, thick, black curtain has descended upon today, and we can't look around it to see what's going to happen tomorrow. The future is opaque. Now, because of the laws of statistics and probability, there are certain things that are likely to happen. Pretty good chance the sun's going to come up tomorrow. Pretty good chance in your mailbox this week will be an application for a credit card. Pretty good chance there's some video on YouTube will go viral. Pretty good chance some presidential candidate will say something bombastic on national television this week. Insurance people because of statistics and laws of probability, can predict, not with 100% accuracy, but pretty close, how many fender benders there will be in Whatcom County in 2016. But they can't tell us if it's you or me or who those fender benders will involve. The future is opaque. We do not know what a day may bring forth. What conclusion did the sages derive from that fact? They said, do not boast. In other words, do not presume upon the future. Do not make grandiose plans, because we don't know. Do not be overly optimistic. Almost what James said in the New Testament in chapter 4. I'm going to paraphrase. James says, come on, you guys. You think you're going to go to such and such a city, start a business, and make profit? Don't be so sure. Why, you do not even know what will happen tomorrow. You boast in your arrogant schemes. All such boasting is evil. So the sages and James say, we don't know what's going to happen tomorrow, so don't boast. I would add, don't worry. Don't be anxious. We don't know. Don't sweat over it. Don't be anxious. Don't fret about the future. Now, having laid that foundation, the following verses I'm going to whip through quickly here are actually quite astonishing. The fact that we don't know what's going to happen tomorrow doesn't mean we can't be optimistic. Just the opposite. These sages were incredibly optimistic. So, do a thought experiment here. It's 4:30 in the morning, back in Bible times. The sage wakes up, lights a candle, it's pitch black out, makes a fire in the fireplace, gets in his comfortable chair, his favorite drink, probably not coffee, hadn't been invented yet, so goat's milk. He's there doing his morning ritual, praying, maybe jotting down the things he observed the day before, maybe writing Proverbs, maybe writing wisdom literature. And outside the window where it's pitch black, slowly he realizes it's getting brighter. In fact, here's what the sage wrote in Proverbs 4, verse 18. Think about the future. The path of the righteous is like the first gleam of dawn, shining ever brighter till the full light of day. So here's the sage. Every morning, 4:30, it's pitch black. And sure enough, I would say like clockwork, but clocks hadn't been invented yet either. But with regularity, the sun comes up day after day, day after day. So the sage says, you know what? There's a lesson here. No matter how dark our world seems in the moment, eventually, the path of the righteous will be like the first gleam of dawn. Remember that old hymn? The darkness shall turn to the dawning, and the dawning till noonday bright. Now, whether or not that hymn writer got that from this proverb, don't know. Not everybody wants to take that leap of faith and embrace the promise that the future is bright. I want to take that leap of faith. I don't like dark. I like light. I want a bright future. But it does take faith. When I was a student years ago, a famous atheist came to our campus, Madeline Murray O'Hare. And I went to her, I hate to call it a lecture, it was more like a rant. And for an hour, she ridiculed religion, and particularly Christianity. At the end of her rant, there was a Q&A. I raised my hand, and she called on me. I said, Ms. O'Hare, I recently read an article in Esquire magazine, an interview with Woody Allen. And he said in that interview, the reason he turned to comedy is because he's terrified living in a universe without purpose. So Ms. O'Hare, what hope do you give to a guy like Woody Allen? Her answer was classic, and has been repeated by every atheist I've read since. She said, none. There is no purpose. To paraphrase, we're a fluke of the universe. It's all random, and there's no purpose. And the problem is not with atheists. The problem is Woody Allen. And he's got to grow up and learn to embrace the reality there is no purpose. I can't go there. I don't want to go there. Part of the reason I take that leap of faith feels better. It's not real profound, but I don't like dark. Second word picture from the proverb, from the sages in chapter 11, verse 28. The righteous will thrive like a green leaf. Notice the sage wrote thrive, and not just survive, but thrive. I like that. So sun comes up, I think bright future. I see a green plant, I think I'm going to thrive. Now we who live in the evergreen state are somewhat spoiled. We can't not see green. That's not the case, I think, back in Bible times. It was desert. It was parched. It was barren. And I suspect, I'm guessing here, that if a farmer planted something back in Bible times and it sprouted, it was like a big deal. I got green in my backyard. Invites the neighbors over. Look, I got green. The sages saw that green leaf and they said, you know what? That's a word picture of our future. And again, it takes a leap of faith. You see the sun come up, I've got a bright future. You see a green plant, it's a reminder, we're going to thrive. We embrace that by faith. Now, at this point, I'm going to pause in my talk and make a public service announcement, for lack of a better word. There are many in this room who attended Vicky's memorial service 2.5 years ago. If you don't know, my wife passed away in September 2013. And many of you were at that service. If I have not properly thanked you for attending, I do so now. Thank you. Your kindness to me and the kids has meant the world to us. Vicky loved this church, knew the church loved us, and your kindness to us was just energy. And we like that. If you have lost a loved one, you know it leaves a hole in your soul that just never quite gets filled. But your kindness to us means so much. In addition to the words in the New Testament where it says, Jesus is a man of sorrows, acquainted with grief. So I take energy from that. Little did Vicky and I realize in January of 2006 that by year's end, she would receive a medical diagnosis of dire proportions. So when the sages say, we don't know what's going to happen tomorrow, yep, you don't know. But when the sages say, when you see sunrise and you think bright future, that's a promise. Hang on to that. When you see a green plant, that's a promise. You hang on to that. We're going to thrive in the future. And I take that leap of faith because it feels good. Okay, end of PSA. Thank you. Back to our sermon, still in progress. There's a third word picture that the sages offered. You're going to love this. In chapter 24, verse 14, says this. Know also that wisdom is like honey for you. For if you find it, there is a future hope for you, and your hope will not be cut off. This is profound. So, you see a sun up tomorrow, you think bright future. You see a green plant, you think we're going to thrive. Next time you taste something sweet, future hope. Hope that will not be cut off. I want to read something to you about taste buds. It's from a very interesting book called The Righteous Mind. The author said this, a few years ago, I tried a restaurant called The True Taste. The interior was entirely white. Each table was set with only spoons, 5 small spoons at each place setting. I sat down at a table, looked at the menu. It was divided into sections labeled sugars, honeys, tree saps, and artificials. I called the waiter over and asked him to explain, don't you serve food here? The waiter, it turned out, was also the owner and sole employee of the restaurant. He told me that the restaurant was the first of its kind in the world. It was a tasting bar for sweeteners. I could sample sweeteners from 32 countries. He explained that he was a biologist who specialized in the sense of taste. He described to me 5 kinds of taste receptor found in each taste bud on the tongue. Sweet, sour, salty, bitter, and savory. He said that in his research, he had discovered that activation of the sweet receptor produced the strongest surge of dopamine in the brain, which indicated to him that humans are hardwired to seek sweetness above the other 4 tastes. He therefore reasoned that it was most efficient in terms of units of pleasure per calorie to consume sweeteners. And he conceived the idea of opening a restaurant aimed entirely at stimulating this one receptor. I asked him, how's business? He said, terrible. But at least I'm doing better than the chemist down the street who opened a salt tasting bar. The The author goes on to explain the restaurant story was made up, but the biology is accurate. When we taste sweet, we get a jolt of dopamine, which is the feel-good neurotransmitter. How did the sages know to compare wisdom to something sweet? You taste sweet, dopamine. You get a taste of wisdom, dopamine. So you see sunrise, bright future. You see a green plant, we're going to thrive. You taste something sweet, we've got hope. One last verse. My favorite character in the book of Proverbs is the virtuous woman in chapter 31. Verse 25 says this: she is clothed with strength and dignity. She can laugh at the days to come. That's astonishing. Now, apparently she knew us in chapter 27. We don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. Don't boast, don't worry. So what do you do about the future? She was able to laugh. I want to be like that woman. How could she do that? I'm guessing, this is conjecture on my part, she knew sunrise meant bright future. Green plant means she's going to thrive. Taste something sweet, she's going to have hope for the future. I want you to also notice in this verse it says she's clothed with strength and dignity, and she can laugh at the days to come. Often we think of a person who has dignity, they are gravitas, solemn, maybe even dour, dignified. And a person who's laughing, oh, you're not very dignified. You know, the sages did not make that distinction. They said you can do both. And I want to be, men and women, strong, dignified, and laugh at the days to come. You want to do a good experiment this week? Get up while it's still dark. Put honey on your toast. Wait for the sun to come up. And when you see green outside your window, you got the best of all possible worlds. 90% of what I said this morning, I could have preached in a Jewish synagogue. It was Hebrew scriptures. They'd love it. 90% of it. But I'm not Jewish. I aspire to be a follower of Jesus. And 1,000 years after all those wisdom books were compiled in the Old Testament, Jesus showed up. And he said this about himself: I tell you that someone greater than Solomon is right here, referring to himself. Jesus said, so you think Solomon, super sage? Here comes Jesus, super duper sage. And if you think that the Proverbs are pretty cool, which I hope you do after this sermon, pardon my grammar, but you ain't seen nothing yet. Because by the time you get to the New Testament, you got Jesus, you got gospel. Let's pray.